There is a petition circulating right now with one demand, and it is not asking for a review or a restructure or greater transparency or any of the other things that petitions about charitable governance typically ask for when they want to sound reasonable. It is asking for Harry to be removed from the Invictus Games entirely, not quietly phased out, not given a reduced role, not transitioned toward an advisory function, while new leadership takes operational control. Removed.
Harry's heartbreak as the showbiz elite dump the Sussex.
And here is what makes that petition so much harder to dismiss than the usual wave of anti-Sussex social media activity. The people behind it are not framing it as an attack on veterans or on the mission the games were built around. They are framing it as a defense of both of those things. An argument that the organization and the veterans it serves would be better positioned without Harry's continued association than they currently are with it. Whether that argument holds up is genuinely contested, but the fact that it is being made publicly and generating the traction it has tells you something important about where the credibility of the project currently sits.
Invictus funds were directed towards private jets, five-star hotels, and transportation for Harry and Meghan.
Keep that in mind as we go through the numbers, because the numbers are where this becomes serious rather than simply controversial. The Vancouver Games brought together 543 wounded and recovering service members from 23 different countries, which is the kind of thing that sounds like everything is working exactly as it should. A genuinely inspiring mission executed at international scale, bringing veterans together from across the world in competitive sport. And then you get to the cost, which was $63.2 million, and the picture starts to look considerably more complicated because that breaks down to $118,000 per competitor, which is before you factor in reports that many of those competitors covered their own flights, paid for their own hotel rooms, and in some cases, funded their own equipment through personal support networks and their own fundraising, rather than through any direct support from the organization running the event that supposedly exists to serve them.
I don't think a lot of veterans actually are devastated. The reality is, if you go deeper into Invictus, a lot of veterans are actually more upset, asking where all the money actually goes.
These are people who suffered service-related injuries, people whose participation in the games is the whole point of the enterprise, traveling at their own expense to an event that cost $118,000 per head to run, while the biggest names connected to the organization were reportedly traveling privately and staying in five-star accommodation. I am going to let that sentence sit there for a moment without embellishment, because I genuinely think it does its own work and I do not want to overdress it. Wardrobe estimates for Meghan's appearances across public events have circulated with figures reaching somewhere around $180,000, though those numbers have been disputed, and I want to be clear that isolated wardrobe estimates for public figures are easy to inflate and difficult to verify, so I hold them at a reasonable distance.
Oh, the Invictus Games, it's great. It does all this. And then, you start looking into it and you're like, hey, what the heck is going on here? Those 535 competitors had to pay their own way. They had to pay their own housing for the games. They had to pay for their own equipment. And Harry and Meghan got a really nice vacation out of it with lots of adorational speeches and clapping and crowds gathered for them.
The cost per competitor figure, however, is not disputed, and it lands very differently when you place it next to what similar events achieve on dramatically smaller budgets. The American Warrior Games running on around $2 million annually. The German equivalent holding a comparable competition for around $200,000 with half the participants. Those differences are not explained by international prestige or production complexity. They are differences that demand a clear accounting of where the money is going and whether it is getting there in a way that serves the mission.
A growing scandal involving Prince Harry and his last remaining genuine charity project, the Invictus Games. But is it really a charity project at all?
If Palace Insider is consistently giving you the full picture on stories like this one, the like button keeps this channel reaching people who want this kind of analysis, and it genuinely helps more than most people realize. Stay with me, because it gets considerably more uncomfortable from here. And this is where the story moves from financial governance questions into something that tells you about how the wider institutional world is reading the Invictus brand right now. Critics have been combing through the financial filings looking for that answer, and what they found was not reassuring for anyone hoping the scrutiny would go away after a single news cycle. The public funding side of the Vancouver Games reportedly included around $15 million from the Canadian federal government and another $15 million from British Columbia. Substantial public money, drawn from tax revenues, committed to an event connected to a British charity and a British royal, which is already an unusual arrangement that would invite scrutiny in most governance contexts. But what critics say they found when they followed the money was stranger than a simple government-to-charity transfer.
I think that will be the beginning of the end for Meghan as a public figure, because this is a man that she's abandoned.
The money reportedly went through a separate corporation, which then paid a licensing fee to the British charity that owns the Invictus name, and the amount of that fee was redacted from public view. That redaction is the detail that set people digging harder and has kept them digging since. Because a licensing fee between a publicly funded corporation and a private British charity paid as part of an arrangement that determines what proportion of Canadian and British Columbian taxpayer money makes its way to actual veterans rather than to operational and licensing costs, is precisely the kind of number that ought to be visible when the whole enterprise is being presented as a charitable mission. Redacting it does not prove anything sinister, but it invites questions that a transparent organization should be able to answer clearly.
Some of the key lines from Paula's brand new and really jaw-dropping reporting this week. And of course, she's been very careful because we know how litigious Prince Harry can be, but this is really extraordinary stuff. So Paula reports, the most recent games held in Vancouver and Whistler in February 2025 brought together 543 wounded military veterans from 23 countries. The total cost, 63.2 million Canadian, or approximately $118,352 per comparison.
And the fact that those questions have been outstanding for as long as they have is itself informative. The Foundation's 2024 accounts, filed after reportedly receiving an extension on the usual deadline, showed direct grants to veterans organizations dropping by around 63% in a single year, from more than £500,000 to roughly £200,000. While foundation income was simultaneously increasing by more than 40%. Read that again slowly, because the direction of those two numbers matters. The money coming in went up substantially, and the money going directly to veterans went down by nearly 2/3 in the same financial year. A new six-figure executive position appeared in those same accounts. Cash reserves reportedly climbed beyond £2 million. Legal fees went from around £45,000 to roughly £155,000, with very little public explanation offered for a tripling in a single year. An American for-profit company received close to £30,000, and the filings apparently offered limited clarity about what exactly they provided for that money. And then there is the registration number discrepancy. Two different company registration numbers appearing in the same set of accounts, one on the cover and another on the balance sheet. Critics have acknowledged this could be a simple administrative error, a clerical mistake of the kind that happens in any organization, particularly one under pressure to file accounts quickly. And I think that is entirely possible and should not be overstated.
Of course, Tom Bauer, in his recent book Betrayal, alleged that Invictus funds were directed towards private jets, five-star hotels, and transportation for Harry and Meghan.
But in the context of everything else that has been raised about this organization's financial transparency, a document that cannot maintain consistent basic details across 2 pages does not help the case that everything else is being handled with the rigor the situation requires. The Foundation has reportedly said that 92% of every pound it receives goes toward charitable activities, and on the surface, that sounds like an impressive figure that should end the conversation. The problem is that what counts as a charitable activity in this context is doing enormous work in that sentence, and critics have been specific about what they mean when they push back on it. Organizing events is a charitable activity. Renting venues is a charitable activity. Travel and accommodation for the production are charitable activities. The full cost of running the games themselves, the logistics, the media production, the ceremony, the hospitality, all of that can legitimately fall under charitable activities without a single additional pound going directly into the hands of a veteran who needs a mobility aid or a therapy program or a piece of equipment that would meaningfully improve their daily life. That is the distinction that critics are trying to draw, and I think it is a legitimate one that deserves to be taken seriously rather than deflected with aggregate figures.
I sense a cover-up. The Invictus Games Foundation, the British charity at the centre of the operation, recently filed its 2024 annual accounts with the UK Charity Commission after a 2-year grace period. The numbers, Paula reports, raised red flags. In 2024, the foundation cut its direct grants to veteran organisations by 63%, from £534,973 to just £200,328. The same year, that foundation income rose 41%. A new 6-figure executive role was added.
The 92% figure is not a lie, but it is an answer to a different question than the one people are asking. And responding to a question about direct veteran support with a figure about total charitable activities is the kind of rhetorical move that may satisfy an audit, but does not address what the critics are actually raising. There is a real and meaningful difference between spending money to run impressive events and spending money in ways that directly help the people those events are supposed to celebrate. And the 92% figure does not tell you anything about that distinction. It tells you that 92% of spending happens under the umbrella of the charity's stated purpose, which is a different question entirely from whether that spending is reaching the people at the center of the mission in the ways they most need it to.
Harry and Meghan came in for 10 minutes for an adoring love shot. And of course, Meghan kissed Harry. And it looked like it was good and full. It wasn't. So I think the public interest is waning. And
Stay with me, because it gets considerably more uncomfortable from here, and this is where the story moves from financial governance questions into something that tells you about the wider perception of the project among the kinds of institutions that make their decisions based on reputation and risk rather than sentiment. Australia had been one of the most consistent and enthusiastic backers of the Invictus Games going back to the project's early years, which is part of what made reports of government support being temporarily withdrawn so striking when they emerged. Because this was not a marginal supporter having second thoughts, this was one of the core nations the Games had built its international identity around, and losing that confidence even temporarily is the kind of thing that signals something about how officials inside a government are reading the situation. The timing was particularly awkward because it reportedly happened while Harry and Meghan were actively encouraging enthusiasm for the project, meaning the news arrived while they were still actively in the room promoting it, and that is a genuinely uncomfortable position for any organization to be in.
also, in this time of economic disparity, people really want to know where their money is going to. And there are lots of other places that actually support veterans, may give them prosthetics if they need, may build a wheelchair ramp at their home, which is necessary, may do things that really help people as opposed to helping Harry's.
Some Australian observers have noted that support was later reinstated, which is true and worth stating clearly. But critics have focused on the original withdrawal rather than the reinstatement, arguing that governments do not pause funding commitments to veterans' sports programs lightly, and that whatever concerns drove that pause reveals something about how officials with professional accountability for public money are assessing the project. Then there is Boeing, which is the kind of detail that people who track corporate sponsorship decisions pay attention to. The aerospace company with deep historical ties to military aviation and defense was one of the major presenting sponsors for Vancouver, and when that sponsorship agreement ended, they did not renew it. Critics have flagged that decision as significant, not because Boeing walking away is necessarily a verdict on the game's integrity. Companies change sponsorship priorities all the time for reasons that have nothing to do with the organization they are leaving, but because the broader trend in private sponsorship tells a story. Vancouver had more than 40 corporate partners. Birmingham has reportedly secured around 11, contributing an estimated £4 million combined. That is a dramatic reduction in private backing, and it becomes consequential when you consider that the UK government has committed up to £26 million in public funding toward Birmingham, a city that has faced widely reported financial pressures, and where the question of whether taxpayers should carry a heavier share as private sponsors step back is one that local residents and journalists have been asking out loud.
Playing with the veteran money because they're getting a lot of funding from countries and places to get this, what would typically be veteran support income that then goes to putting on the Invictus Games. Now, again, I'm not trying to be, belittling what the Invictus Games is trying to do, but I am asking the question of, is it really the best use of veteran funding?
According to some reports, there have also been concerns that qualified professionals have been hesitant to pursue positions connected to the Birmingham operation because of the reputational questions surrounding the Invictus brand. That is a different category of problem from funding shortfalls, and it cannot be solved by running a well-produced event or by Harry showing up and doing his best. If the people you need to attract to make the thing work are asking themselves whether they want their names attached to it, that is a structural credibility challenge that requires a different kind of response than operational improvements. There is a passage in Tom Bauer's book about the games that went around the internet and generated exactly the reaction you would expect from a story with that kind of charged detail. A wheelchair basketball match between the United States and Nigeria, at the end of which some American players reportedly stood up and walked away from their wheelchairs. The response divided almost immediately along the lines you would expect. Some people reading that as an implicit suggestion that the athletes were not genuinely injured or disabled, which would be a damaging implication to attach to an event built around recognizing service-related conditions, and other voices pointing out, correctly and importantly, that not every service-related injury or condition is visible to the eye, that psychological trauma is a serious and genuine service-related condition that deserves full recognition and respect, and that making assumptions about any individual's medical situation from a single reported observation is neither fair nor useful. Both of those responses contain something true. And the reason this particular passage generated so much sustained debate is that it sits at the precise intersection of two things people care about deeply: the integrity of the competitive classifications that give these events their meaning, and the broader credibility of the organization responsible for setting and enforcing those classifications. Those are two separate concerns that should be evaluated separately. But in the current climate around Invictus, they have a tendency to pull toward each other. And that is part of what makes honest scrutiny of the event so difficult to conduct without it being read as an attack on the competitors. There have also been claims about attendance at some events that have circulated widely, reports suggesting that certain competitions drew sparse crowds, with volunteers outnumbering spectators in the stands, and questions about whether camera angles and production choices created a more populated impression on television than the venues actually contained. I want to be appropriately cautious about these claims because they are difficult to verify from the outside, and the people making them have an obvious incentive to emphasize anything that reflects badly on the games. But they have come from enough people who say they attended events in person that they register as something worth noting as part of the overall picture rather than simply dismissing. Before we get to the broader pattern, there is one more detail from the Sussex side of this news cycle that has been circulating and that I think is worth briefly addressing in the context of everything else. There have been reports of a gift package being sent by Meghan's brand operation to a social media user who had previously posted critical comments about William and Catherine. Critics seized on the story immediately, arguing it reflected either a failure of due diligence or a deliberate decision to reward anti-Wales sentiment, while supporters argued the story was being blown out of proportion and that the significance of a gift bag being sent to the wrong person was being dramatically inflated. I am genuinely not sure which reading is more accurate, but the story has stuck around in the conversation, and I mention it because it fits the broader theme of this week, which is the question of whether the people managing the Sussex brand operation have the judgment and the attention to detail that the situation they are navigating actually requires. Now here is where the conversation around Invictus connects to something that goes well beyond one charity and one set of financial filings. And this is the part I think deserves the most sustained attention because it speaks to a pattern rather than an incident. When Harry received the Pat Tillman Award, named after a former NFL player who left professional sport to enlist and was killed in Afghanistan, the debate that followed was immediate and intense and divided almost perfectly along lines that tell you a great deal about where public confidence in Harry's institutional associations currently sits. Supporters made a genuine and reasonable case. Invictus would not exist at the international scale it occupies without Harry's personal involvement and commitment. And the Pat Tillman Award honors people who create pathways for veterans, not just those who served on the front line themselves. Critics made an equally genuine, if uncomfortable, counterargument that the award was going to someone whose primary contribution was his public profile and institutional weight rather than direct hands-on service. and that there were people in the veterans advocacy space whose work deserved the recognition more and was less visible specifically because they lacked Harry's celebrity platform. I do not think either argument is straightforwardly right, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. But the scale of the reaction tells you something real about the current state of trust. Add Sentebale, the charity Harry co-founded in memory of his mother, which over the course of several years became the focus of leadership disputes, legal proceedings, and public resignations that generated months of uncomfortable coverage, eventually ending with Harry's own departure from the organization he had helped create. Add African Parks, where Harry held a board position and which faced serious allegations that attracted widespread media attention and have not been fully resolved in the public arena. The pattern that critics identify across these situations, and I want to be clear that I am describing a critic's argument rather than pronouncing a verdict, is not that Harry is malicious or that his stated commitment to these causes is insincere. The argument is that the organizations around him tend to accumulate complications, and that the complications tend to become public, and that the public nature of those complications then makes everyone associated with the organizations harder to attract, harder to retain, and harder to fund. Whether that pattern reflects something about Harry's judgment in choosing institutional roles and managing the governance questions that come with them, or the environment of intense scrutiny that surrounds everything connected to his name, or the fact that complicated organizations attract complicated coverage in ways that have nothing to do with the individuals on the board, or some combination of all three, is genuinely uncertain. But it is a pattern that now has enough instances that ignoring it requires a deliberate choice to look away. The theory gaining traction is an uncomfortable one to state plainly. Either Harry does not fully grasp the scale of what has built up around his association with these organizations, or he does grasp it and has not found a way to respond to it that involves the kind of genuine reset the situation probably requires, meaning a moment where he steps back publicly, acknowledges the questions that have been raised, and creates some separation between himself and the governance of the organizations that would allow them to re-establish credibility on their own terms rather than as extensions of his public persona. The alternative path, which is showing up in Birmingham this summer as though the petition and the dropped sponsors and the redacted licensing fee and the 63% reduction in direct grants to veterans are all manageable background footnotes, risk cementing the impression that the mission of the games has become secondary to the continuation of Harry's association with them as a public platform. And that is the impression, more than any individual financial figure or governance question, that the veterans who funded their own flights to Vancouver most deserve not to have attached to something they participated in and gave their effort and their courage to. Senior royals are reportedly keeping their distance from Birmingham. Not Charles, not William, not Catherine. I have seen the argument made that this reflects personal tensions within the family more than anything else, and I think that argument has some validity. But I have also seen the argument that it reflects institutional caution, a calculation by a household that has its own reputation to manage about whether being photographed enthusiastically at an Invictus event, given everything that is accumulated around it, is something that serves their interests. Both of those things can be partially true simultaneously. What the absence communicates, regardless of the motivation behind it, is a signal, and in combination with Boeing's departure and the sponsorship numbers and the ongoing petition, it is a signal that the current public standing of the organization's public standing is moving in a direction that nobody involved can be entirely comfortable with. Harry is expected to be there. Not showing up, given how personally and publicly identified he is with the games at this point, is essentially not a realistic option. It would become the story instantly and would likely generate worse coverage than anything that could happen if he attends. But the question that matters considerably more than whether he shows up, and that will determine whether Birmingham is a turning point or simply another chapter in the same ongoing story, is what he says and does before he gets there. Whether the organization engages publicly and seriously with the financial questions that have been raised rather than retreating behind aggregate figures that do not answer what people are actually asking, and whether Birmingham becomes a moment where the conversation starts to change because someone involved decided that honesty and transparency would serve the games better in the long run than continued defensiveness. The veterans who have participated in these games and who will participate in Birmingham deserve an organization that can answer basic questions about where the money goes without redacting the most important number in the document. They deserve direct grants that are moving in the right direction relative to the organization's income, not in the opposite direction. They deserve an event that is remembered for what they achieved rather than for the governance questions that swirled around the institution supporting them. Whether they get that is entirely dependent on decisions that are being made right now, before the games begin, by people who have the information and the authority to make them differently if they choose to. What do you make of all of this? Do you think the Invictus Games can find a cleaner path forward in Birmingham? Or has too much accumulated for this summer to function as anything close to a genuine reset? And do you think Harry understands what is actually being asked of him here? Or is there a gap between how he reads the situation and how people outside his orbit are reading it? Drop it in the comments. I want your honest read on this one. Subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you in the next one.